There is a story most people carry about retirement, a story they've been refining for decades, adjusting here and there, updating the numbers, but never quite questioning the shape of it. It goes something like this. You work, you save, you reach a number, and then life opens up. The pressure lifts, the mornings become yours, the choices become lighter. You finally arrive at the version of yourself you were always working toward. That story is so familiar, so deeply embedded in how we plan and how we live, that most people never stop to ask whether it's actually true, whether the retirement they've been building toward exists in the way they've been imagining it, whether the relief they've been promised is waiting at the other end, or whether it's something they invented to make the decades of sacrifice feel worth it. The uncomfortable truth is that for a lot of people, it's the second one. The retirement they believed in was a story they needed to tell themselves, and by the time they discovered it wasn't quite real, they were already living in the consequences of having believed it for too long. This isn't about pessimism. It isn't about suggesting that retirement is a fraud, or that the years after work can't be meaningful or peaceful or full. They can be. But there is a version of retirement that lives in our heads, constructed over years from assumptions, projections, and quiet hopes that is not the same as the retirement that actually arrives. And the distance between those two things, between the imagined version and the real one, is where most of the financial pain of later life is born. Not in bad investments, not in market crashes, not even in poor planning, in the gap between what was believed and what turned out to be true. The first lie is the simplest one. It's the lie about the number. Almost everyone who thinks seriously about retirement has a number in mind, a balance they're working toward, a point at which they'll feel ready. And that number, whatever it is, carries enormous psychological weight. It becomes the finish line, the thing that makes the decades of discipline feel purposeful. But the number is almost always wrong. Not because the math is bad, because the life that the number was calculated for doesn't stand still. It shifts. Costs change, health changes, relationships change. What felt like enough at 45 when the number was first formed often doesn't feel like enough at 62 when the reality of what retirement actually costs. The second lie is about time. There is an assumption buried inside most retirement plans that is almost never spoken out loud. The assumption that retirement will feel the way vacation feels, that the freedom from obligation will translate directly into lightness, into ease, into a life that moves at a pace you choose. And for some people, for a period, it does. The first months can feel like the exhale of a lifetime. The mornings feel different. The calendar feels different. The weight of Monday, which you carried for 40 years, simply isn't there anymore. And that absence, at first, feels like exactly what you were promised. But what most people don't anticipate is what comes after the exhale. The structure that work provided, the rhythm, the sense of contribution, the identity that came from having somewhere to be and something to produce, doesn't disappear gracefully when you retire. It leaves a space. And that space is not automatically filled with the hobbies and travel and grandchildren that the retirement brochures promised. For a significant number of people, that space becomes something unexpected, something heavier, a kind of purposelessness that they were completely unprepared for, because they were so focused on getting to the finish line that they never thought carefully about what they were running toward, only
We are
about
at a
what they were
pivotal
running
moment.
away
Fiscal
from.
reforms cannot be delayed.
The
Our
third
duty
lie
demands
is about
responsible action now.
certainty. Retirement planning is, at its core, an exercise in predicting the unpredictable. You calculate based on assumptions, assumed return rates, assumed inflation, assumed lifespan, assumed healthcare costs, assumed spending patterns. And every single one of those assumptions is a guess dressed up in the language of precision. The spreadsheets feel authoritative. The projections feel solid. The plan feels like a plan. But underneath all of it is a vast layer of uncertainty that the numbers cannot absorb. The market doesn't perform the way the projections assumed. Inflation runs hotter than expected for longer than expected. A health event arrives that costs more than a spouse's situation changes. A child needs help. The house that was supposed to be an asset becomes a liability. Any one of these things can fracture a plan that looked perfectly constructed on paper. And most people, because they trusted the numbers, because they believed the plan was more solid than it was, are genuinely shocked when it starts to bend. They feel cheated, not because someone deceived them, but because the certainty they thought they had purchased turned out to be an illusion they had sold themselves. The fourth lie is perhaps the most personal one. It's the lie about who you will be when you get there. And it is the one that almost no financial conversation ever touches, because it isn't about money at all. It is about self, about the quiet, persistent belief that a change in circumstances will produce a change in character, that the version of yourself you've been trying to become for decades will finally emerge once the external pressure is removed. This belief is so common, so quietly universal, that it rarely gets examined. It just exists underneath the planning, underneath the saving, underneath the whole architecture of the retirement dream. Most people imagine that retirement will bring a version of themselves they haven't been able to fully inhabit during the working years, more patient, more present, less anxious, finally at peace with the things that used to
I don't
cause
understand
tension.
this.
But identity doesn't transform at 65 the way we imagine it will. The worries that followed you through your 50s don't evaporate the day you leave your job. The patterns of thought, the tendencies toward anxiety or comparison or regret don't get filed away with the badge and the briefcase. They come with you, into the quieter mornings, into the longer stretches of unstructured time, and sometimes, without the distraction of work to occupy the foreground, they become louder, more present, more difficult to manage. The retirement you imagined was populated by a version of yourself that didn't quite exist, and the one you actually inhabit is populated by the same self you've always been, in a context that offers fewer of the old familiar ways to avoid yourself. And then there is the lie that lives underneath all the others, the one that is the hardest to examine because it is the most human. The belief that getting through it, surviving the decades of work and obligation and financial pressure, will feel like enough. That arriving at the other side will carry its own reward. That the sacrifice will be vindicated by the peace that follows. But peace, real peace, is not a destination. It is not waiting at a particular account balance or a particular age. It does not arrive automatically when the alarm stops going off in the morning. It has to be constructed, deliberately, from the inside. And a lot of people reach retirement without having built the interior capacity for it, because they were so focused on building the external conditions that they assumed the interior part would take care of itself. It doesn't. And discovering that, late, when the structure of work is gone, and the children are raised, and the mortgage is paid, and all the things that used to require your energy have quietly resolved themselves, can be one of the most disorienting experiences of a life. To have arrived somewhere you spent decades trying to reach, and to find that it doesn't feel the way you thought it would, that the relief isn't as complete as you needed it to be, that the story you told yourself about this chapter was not quite the story that was waiting for you. None of this means the years ahead are without value. They can hold enormous value, depth, meaning, a kind of freedom that the working years genuinely couldn't offer, moments of genuine rest, of presence, of watching something grow that you planted long ago. Those things are real. They exist. But they will not hold those things automatically. They will not deliver them simply because you saved enough or waited long enough or worked hard enough. They require the same honesty that any meaningful chapter of life requires. The willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what you were hoping for. To grieve the version of retirement that didn't materialize, quietly, without too much drama, and then to build something real from what remains. Something that doesn't depend on a story being true. Something grounded in the actual life in front of you, with its actual constraints and its actual possibilities, rather than the imagined one you carried for so long that it started to feel like a promise someone had made to you. The lie we tell ourselves about retirement is not a cynical one. It is a hopeful one. It is the story we needed in order to keep going, in order to make the sacrifice feel coherent, in order to believe that the future held something worth working toward. And there is something almost tender about that, about the way human beings construct meaning around their labor by imagining a reward that justifies it. But hope, when it hardens into assumption, stops being a resource and starts being a liability. It stops being something that pulls you forward and starts being something that blinds you to what is actually in front of you. And the people who suffer most in retirement are often not the ones who saved the least. They are the ones who believed the most completely. The ones who trusted the story so thoroughly that they never built anything outside of it. They arrived at the destination and found it populated by a life they hadn't prepared for, because the life they were preparing for turned out to be a version that only existed in the planning. And the most important question, the one that retirement eventually forces you to sit with, whether you're ready or not, is whether the life you're living now, today, in the reality of what is actually here, is one you can find meaning in. Not the life you planned, not the one you imagined, the one that is actually, quietly, irreversibly yours.